The illusion of invincibility. Rome didn't fall to invaders. It killed itself. Picture the year 117 AD. The empire is at its absolute peak, stretching from the rain-soaked hills of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Syria. If you lived then, you believed Rome was eternal. The streets were paved with wealth. Aqueducts poured fresh water into booming cities. The legions were an unstoppable, highly disciplined machine. But look closer. Underneath the gleaming white marble, the foundation is quietly cracking. We are taught that Rome fell because massive hordes of barbarians smashed through the gates. That is a myth. The truth is far more terrifying. Long before the first enemy crossed the border, the greatest superpower in human history had already hollowed itself out. It died from greed. It died from political sabotage. And most tragically, it died because everyday citizens simply stopped believing in the idea of Rome. This is the autopsy of an empire, and the symptoms look disturbingly familiar. The silent rot of inflation. The rot began silently in the pockets of the everyday Roman. To understand how a superpower dies, you have to look at its wallet. By the 3rd century, Rome had a massive problem. The empire had stopped expanding. For generations, Rome paid for its massive, bloated military by conquering new lands, stealing their gold, and taxing their people. It was a giant, violent pyramid scheme. But when the borders stopped moving, the free gold vanished. Yet, the cost of running the empire kept going up. The emperors had thousands of soldiers demanding higher pay. If an emperor didn't pay, the soldiers would simply assassinate him and find a leader who would. To survive, the government did something desperate. They started shrinking the amount of real silver in their coins. They mixed it with cheap metals. At first, no one noticed. But year after year, the silver content dropped. A coin that was once 95% pure silver became less than 2%. The government thought they had solved their crisis, the death of savings, but you cannot trick economics. The consequence was catastrophic. As the coins lost their true value, merchants demanded more of them for the same goods. A loaf of bread that cost a fraction of a denarius suddenly cost dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Picture a hard-working baker in Rome. He spent 40 years saving his silver coins in a chest under his floorboards, dreaming of passing a legacy to his children. Within a single decade, those savings became completely worthless. He wasn't robbed by bandits. He was robbed by his own government's monetary policy. Families who had lived comfortably were suddenly starving. They couldn't afford basic medicine. They couldn't afford clothes. To survive, everyday citizens started bartering again, trading grain for shoes, just like their primitive ancestors. The government's response to this massive inflation? They just raised taxes even higher. The social contract between the state and the citizens wasn't just broken, it was shattered. The predators in purple, while the citizens starved, the leaders turned on each other. You might think an economic crisis would unite a nation. In Rome, it sparked a bloodbath. Welcome to the crisis of the 3rd century. Over a period of just 50 years, Rome had 26 different emperors. Almost all of them were murdered. The military, once the proud defenders of the borders, realized they had the real power. Generals stopped looking outward at the enemies and started looking inward at the throne. Civil war became the new normal. Imagine being a farmer near the border. You pay crushing taxes to fund the army, but instead of protecting your farm from raiders, that army marches off to fight another Roman army over who gets to wear the purple cloak. Whole provinces were stripped of their defenses. The psychological damage was immense. The citizens realized a horrifying truth. The government was no longer a protector, it was a predator. The legions were just armed gangs fighting for control of a sinking ship. The extinction of the middle class. To fund these endless civil wars, the tax collectors became merciless. In the early days of the empire, local politicians competed to build public baths and roads. It was a badge of honor. But as the empire starved for cash, the government made these local leaders personally responsible for collecting taxes. If the town couldn't pay, the local leader had to pay out of his own pocket. It was financial suicide. Overnight, public service became a death sentence. Wealthy citizens abandoned their massive estates, fleeing into the woods just to escape the tax collectors. And the middle class? They were wiped out completely. Small, independent farmers were crushed by the burden. To avoid starvation, they sold their tiny plots of land to wealthy billionaires and agreed to work the land as tenant farmers. They lost their freedom. They were tied to the soil, forbidden from leaving. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was the absolute destruction of the Roman middle class, creating a society of extreme wealth and extreme poverty. Outsourcing survival with the middle class destroyed, Rome faced a terrifying question. Who is going to fight in the army? In the past, Roman legions were filled with patriotic citizens defending their homeland. But a starving, overtaxed farmer tied to a billionaire's land has no reason to fight. He owns nothing. He has nothing to defend. So, the Roman government made a fatal decision. They outsourced their military. They looked across the borders to the Germanic tribes, the very people they called barbarians, and hired them as mercenaries. At first, it seemed like a brilliant cost-saving measure. But think about the danger. You are handing the keys to your gates to people who have no loyalty to your flag, no belief in your history, and no stake in your future. They were fighting for a paycheck, not for Rome. Picture the whiteboard drawing, a classic Roman shield, but the hand holding it belongs to a foreign mercenary. The empire had successfully outsourced its own survival. It was a ticking time bomb, tearing the map in half. The empire was simply too big and too broken to be managed by one person. So, they tore it in half. In a desperate attempt to save the state, the Emperor Diocletian literally drew a line down the map. The western half governed from Italy. The eastern half governed from Greece. It was meant to be a temporary administrative fix, but it created a deep, permanent fracture. The east was rich, highly populated, and heavily fortified. The west was poor, rural, and exposed. Instead of helping each other, the two halves became bitter rivals. Imagine two brothers in a lifeboat that is taking on water. Instead of bailing the water out together, they start fighting over who gets the dry side of the boat. The East began intentionally redirecting barbarian tribes toward the West, just to spare their own cities. Unity was dead. The idea of one, indivisible Rome was gone. The empire was cutting off its own limbs, just to keep the heart beating a little longer. The refugee crisis at the Danube, the stage, was completely set for a catastrophe. And in the year 376 AD, arrived at the Danube River, a massive, terrifying new threat had emerged from the Asian steppes. The Huns. They were slaughtering everything in their path. Fleeing in absolute terror, an entire nation of Gothsmen, women, and children arrived at the Roman border. They weren't an invading army. They were desperate refugees. They stood on the riverbank, starving, begging the Roman emperor for asylum. They offered to farm the empty land and fight in the Roman army in exchange for basic safety. The emperor agreed. It could have been a brilliant diplomatic triumph. A massive influx of grateful, hardworking new citizens to revitalize the dying provinces. But the Roman system was far too corrupt to handle it. The local Roman commanders put in charge of feeding the refugees saw an opportunity to get incredibly rich. The ultimate betrayal. What happened next is one of the darkest betrayals in human history. The Roman commanders, Lupicinus and Maximus, hoarded the food meant for the refugees and sold it on the black market at extortionate prices. The Goths were trapped in concentration camps, slowly starving to death. Mothers watched their babies wither away. Then, the Romans made an offer. They would provide meat, dog meat, rotting carcasses of stray dogs gathered from the streets. But the price was unimaginable. To get a single piece of rotting dog meat, a Gothic family had to sell their own children into Roman slavery. The psychological snap was immediate. These people came seeking safety, and Rome stripped them of their humanity. The Goths didn't hate Rome when they arrived, but after watching their children dragged away in chains, they realized they had nothing left to lose. The refugees picked up their weapons. The shockwave of Adrianople, the resulting explosion, changed the ancient world forever. The year is 378 AD, the Battle of Adrianople. The Gothic refugees, fueled by unimaginable trauma and pure rage, met the mighty Roman legions on the battlefield. The Emperor Valens himself led the charge, absolutely confident he would crush the rebellion. But Rome was weak. Its tactics were outdated, its soldiers unmotivated. The Goths absolutely annihilated them. 2/3 of the Roman field army was slaughtered in a single bloody afternoon. The Emperor Valens was trapped in a wooden farmhouse. The Goths barred the doors and burned it to the ground. An emperor of Rome, reduced to ashes by the people his government had exploited. The shockwave paralyzed the civilized world. The myth of Roman invincibility was completely dead. The legions could be beaten. The gates could be breached. Rome had engineered its own massacre through pure, unchecked greed. There was no going back. The end had officially begun. The psychological death of Rome. The final blows came slowly, then all at once. By the year 410 AD, the absolute unthinkable happened. A Gothic king named Alaric marched his army right up to the massive walls of Rome itself. But they didn't even have to break the gates down. Someone inside, perhaps a starving slave or an exhausted citizen, simply unlocked them. For the first time in 800 years, a foreign army walked freely through the streets of the Eternal City. The sack of Rome wasn't a fiery, bloody apocalypse. It was a methodical, quiet stripping of wealth. They took the gold, they stripped the altars, they emptied the treasuries. The psychological death of Rome was absolute. When news reached the distant provinces, grown men wept openly in the streets. The anchor of the civilized world had been ripped away. If Rome could fall, nothing was safe. But the physical city was already a ghost town. The capital had moved. The emperors were hiding in swamps. The heart had stopped beating long ago. A whisper, not a roar. The actual end of the Western Roman Empire was barely a whisper. There was no epic final stand, no dramatic cinematic battle. In the year 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer walked into the palace and approached the final emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer didn't kill him. He didn't even imprison him. He simply took the crown off the boy's head, packed it in a wooden box, and shipped it east. He told them, "We don't need an emperor in the West anymore." He gave the teenage boy a pension and sent him away to the countryside. That was it. A millennium of undisputed global supremacy, ending with a bureaucratic retirement package. The empire didn't fall because the barbarians were simply too strong. It fell because the rot from within had completely destroyed its core. When a society abandons its middle class, ruins its currency, and treats its own people as expendable, it doesn't need an enemy. It will gladly destroy itself.